So this is the second part of the sermon, focusing on the Mark chapter 8 passage. I think it began at verse 31. It did, verse 31 to the end. It was clear that the old covenant was not doing the job it was supposed to do, certainly as far as the Israelites were concerned. They could not live by it. Well, God knew that when he gave it them, but they had to learn that by their own experience. So there had to be another way. And hence we come to this gospel reading and the coming of Jesus. God knew that they couldn't fulfill every law. He knew they couldn't do it on their own. And so what did he have to do? God ultimately came himself, which brings us to the New Testament. The passage that I read in the Old Testament is looking forward to God's answer, as it were, the coming of the Messiah in some form, even though it wasn't obvious then. It's easy to look back and to impose what we know now onto the past. But they didn't have that opportunity then. We come to this reading from Mark, and in a number of occasions in the New Testament, Jesus quotes from the passage in Isaiah. The passage read in Mark is a hinge point, really. In chapter 8, the whole tenet of the book changes. It changes from that point where Jesus says, "Who do men say I am?" And the disciples say, "You are the Christ, the living God." From that point on, including the bit that we've just read, the book of Mark starts to look forward to Holy Week and to the cross and to the resurrection. It looks forward to that part of it. The whole essence of the book changes its viewpoint. It's looking forward to the cross. But the question is does that passage in Isaiah actually refer to Jesus and the cross? Well, there's a number of places in the New Testament, and I'm just going to quote some of them, why the suffering servant looks very much like it was Jesus. In Matthew chapter 8 and verses 14 to 17, it says this. This is Jesus coming into Peter's house where Peter's mother-in-law is laying ill. And it says, when evening came, many who were demon-possessed were brought to him, and drove out the spirits with a word, and healed all the sick. This was to fulfill, verse 17, what was spoken through the prophet Isaiah. He took up our infirmities and bore our diseases. That can be found in the passage that I read earlier at the end of Isaiah chapter 52 and verse 53. So there it is. He took up our infirmities and bore our diseases. And it even says this was said to fulfill what was spoken to the prophet Isaiah. In John chapter 12 and verse 37 to 41, it says, after Jesus had performed so many signs in their presence, they would not believe him. It says this was to fulfill the word of Isaiah the prophet, and he quotes again, Lord, who has believed our message, and to whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed? That's the second quote. Thirdly, in Luke chapter 22 and verse 36, it says this, it is written, he was numbered with the transgressors. It says more than that, but I'm just trying to shorten it. He was numbered with the transgressors. There again, that's a direct quote. In 1 Peter chapter 2 and verse 19 to 25, quoting Isaiah 53 verses 4 to 6 in chapter 9, it says this, to this you were called, because Christ suffered for you, leaving you an example that you should follow in his steps. Here's the quote, he committed no sins, and no deceit was found in his mouth. But when they'd hurled their insults at him, he did not retaliate. Instead he entrusted himself to him who judges justly. He himself bore our sins in his body on the cross, so that we might die to sin and live for righteousness. For by his wounds you have been healed. For you were like sheep going astray, but now you have returned to the shepherd and overseer of your souls. And finally in Acts chapter 8, I could go on, there are more of them. Acts chapter 8 and verses 32 to 35, it says he was like a sheep led to the slaughter, and as a lamb before its shearer is silent, so he did not open his mouth, etc., etc. Romans chapter 10 and verses 16, and so it goes on. And we can see from this that on a number of occasions Jesus points to himself as the suffering servant. It even says a number of occasions, as was written in the book of Isaiah. And in Paul's writings in that letter to Peter, there's a Romans reading, Romans chapter 10 verse 16 to 17, and the Acts reading. Those quotes from the Old Testament from Isaiah are directly pointed towards Jesus. So Jesus was, and said, was Jesus a suffering servant? It would point to it, and Jesus seems to point to himself in that way. When Jesus spoke in Mark, which is recorded in that chapter 8, his disciples had no idea really what he was talking about. I'm not sure whether it was really clear to them at all. I guess it wasn't. But Jesus does say quite clearly, he talks about his own death. He talks about other things that relate to it, particular points of significance. Jesus came to die because the Old Testament, the Old Covenant, had failed. Ultimately, the Israelites, Judah, could not fulfill the law, and ultimately God's judgment on them was they went into exile. Because they went into exile, it was obvious they wasn't going to, no matter how long God gave them, they were not going to be able to fulfill all that the law called them to do. So ultimately there was only one answer, and that was that God came himself. Israel, Judea were looking for an answer. Were looking for the one who was going to come. In their eyes, they were looking for one who was going to come and restore them as a nation. They were once again going to become top dog. They were going to probably, in their eyes, oppress others as they'd been oppressed for hundreds of years. They were going to actually regain all the land they'd lost and the power and the authority. But God's answer was very different, and it's no wonder that they missed it when it was different, because they were not expecting something like this. Even for them to read that passage from Isaiah, it was not obvious that that was how God was going to do it. How could it be obvious when they were looking at a completely different place? The passage from Isaiah paints a picture of a coming time when God's going to pour out, it seems to be, the punishment for sin on one individual, and that individual is going to suffer for the nation. That individual, as we read through the New Testament, was Jesus. So is Jesus a suffering servant? It would seem to be, to me, that that's what it points to. That Isaiah, all those years ago, 700 odd years before Jesus, he wrote about the coming of one who would suffer on behalf of the nation. That he would suffer, that he would be marred, all the things that Jesus was, and that he would pay the price for the nation. He could not know beyond that what it really meant. But as we know now, Jesus paid the price for our sins so that we can be reconciled to God. Jesus knew it, although to what degree he totally knew it, I don't know. But he was aware of his own death that was going to come upon him. And as we continue to journey throughout Lent, we will learn more about Jesus and the path that he trod. But as important to all these things is, what does it mean for us? Is it just an interesting piece of information, or does it mean something more significant for us? That might be one of the things that we might want to talk about on Wednesday when we meet for our discussion group. If you're free on Wednesday, we'll be meeting again next Wednesday at 7 o'clock. I will send out the link through Zoom. And please do join with us as we consider what the implications are of Jesus the suffering servant is for us. Is there ever going to be a successful church that's going to sort of rule across the world? I don't think so. I don't think so at all. I don't think that is actually God's way of acting. It seems to me that over my 40 odd years of being a Christian, the stronger the church is, the more visible it is, the more it seems to have got the backing that it has, the more finances it has. In actual fact, the easier it is to stray away from the message of Jesus. But it seems to me that as we read the scriptures and as we see the church in many places weak and struggling, in actual fact, it's in our weakness that we embody the message of the good news of Jesus. So those are some things we might like to consider and discuss when we meet on Wednesday night. So we're going to go to our next song, which I'm sorry I can't tell you what it is because I've not got it on the screen. Thank you for listening. Bye.